Most women try to reach a man's heart through his mind. They believe that if they can just explain their feelings clearly enough, analyze the relationship logically enough, or communicate their needs perfectly enough, they will finally break through to him. But there's a fundamental disconnect happening that goes deeper than most people realize. Women often approach relationships like they're solving a puzzle, gathering pieces of information, analyzing patterns, trying to decode what he's really feeling. They believe that connection comes through understanding, through talking things through emotional transparency. Men, however, don't connect the same way. While women find intimacy in sharing thoughts and feelings, men often find intimacy in shared presence, in doing rather than discussing, in silence that feels comfortable rather than silence that needs to be filled. A woman might feel closest to her partner after a deep 3-hour conversation about their relationship. A man might feel closest after simply sitting together watching the sunset, saying nothing at all. This creates a painful cycle. The more a woman tries to connect through words and emotional analysis, the more a man might retreat. It's not because he doesn't want connection. It's because the way she's offering it doesn't match the way his soul receives it. And the more he retreats, the more she tries to bridge the gap with more talking, more explaining, more emotional processing. She begins to think he's emotionally unavailable. He begins to think she's overwhelming. Both are wrong. The truth is, masculine energy tends to be action-oriented rather than discussion-oriented. Where feminine energy seeks to explore and express feelings, masculine energy seeks to solve and protect. Where feminine energy finds safety in sharing vulnerabilities, masculine energy finds safety in providing strength. Neither approach is wrong. They're just different languages of the soul. And when you try to speak to someone's soul in a language it doesn't understand, you might as well be speaking to a wall. But here's what changes everything, and what most people never discover. There's a hidden doorway into a man's soul that bypasses all of this confusion. It's not what you say to him. It's not how you express your feelings. It's something that speaks directly to who he is at his core. And once you understand this, everything shifts. Not just how he responds to you, but how he sees you, how he prioritizes you, and how deeply he connects with you. This is where Carl Jung's insights become crucial, because what he discovered about the masculine psyche changes everything we think we know about connection. Jung spent decades studying the human soul, and one of his most profound discoveries was about what he called the anima, the feminine aspect that exists within every man's psyche. But here's what most people misunderstand. Jung didn't just identify this feminine side. He revealed something far more important, that a man's deepest connection to his own soul happens through this inner feminine energy. Think about this for a moment. Every man carries within him an unconscious image of the feminine, not just women in general, but an idealized feminine energy that represents his deepest longings, his creativity, his capacity for love and connection. This isn't just theory. This is the invisible force that determines who he's drawn to, who he opens up to, and who he allows into the deepest parts of himself. When a woman tries to connect with a man through logic, reasoning, or emotional analysis, she's speaking to his conscious mind, the part of him that's already guarded, already thinking, already protecting itself. But when she learns to speak to his anima, she's communicating directly with the part of him that craves connection, that yearns to be understood, that desperately wants to let someone in. The problem is, most women have no idea this inner feminine exists within men. They see his external masculine energy, his logic, his problem-solving, his emotional reserve, and they assume that's all there is. So they try to connect with him the way they would connect with that surface-level masculine energy, and it doesn't work. But the women who understand this, the ones who learn to speak to a man's anima, they become unforgettable. Not because they're manipulating him, but because they're connecting with the part of him that's been waiting his entire life to be seen. So how do you recognize a man's anima? How do you speak to this hidden part of his soul? The first thing to understand is that his anima often appears in his contradictions. The tough, logical man who gets unexpectedly emotional during certain movies, the practical businessman who secretly writes poetry, the reserved introvert who becomes passionate when talking about his dreams. These aren't weaknesses or inconsistencies, they're glimpses of his anima breaking through. Most women make the mistake of only seeing and responding to his dominant masculine energy. They relate to his strength, his logic, his decisiveness. But they ignore or dismiss the softer moments, the vulnerable glimpses, the times when his inner feminine shows itself. And in doing so, they miss the very doorway they've been searching for. Jung discovered that men often project their anima onto the women in their lives. This means the woman who captures a man's soul is usually the one who somehow embodies or awakens his inner feminine qualities. She becomes the external representation of what he's been unconsciously seeking within himself. This is where it gets deeper, and where most people get this completely wrong. It's not about becoming softer, more nurturing, or more traditionally feminine. That's a surface-level understanding that misses the point entirely. Jung's anima is not about gender roles or stereotypes. It's about connecting with the creative, intuitive, feeling-oriented part of his psyche that he's often learned to suppress. The woman who truly connects with a man's soul doesn't try to be his anima. She recognizes it, honors it, and creates space for it to emerge. She sees the poet in the businessman. She acknowledges the dreamer in the realist. She doesn't try to fix his emotions or analyze his feelings. She simply allows them to exist without judgment. This is why some women can have a 5-minute conversation with a man and he'll remember it for years, while others can spend months trying to connect and never break through. It's not about what they said, it's about which part of him they were speaking to. And this is where the real transformation begins. Because when you learn to recognize and honor a man's anima, something profound happens. He doesn't just feel understood, he feels seen in a way that goes beyond words, beyond logic, beyond the masks he wears every day. He begins to associate you with the deepest, most authentic part of himself. You become the person who sees him not just as he presents himself to the world, but as he truly is, beneath all the layers of protection and performance. The question then becomes, how do you actually do this? How do you speak to a man's anima in practical, everyday situations? The first principle is presence over pressure. When a man shares something vulnerable, a fear, a dream, a moment of uncertainty, most women instinctively want to respond, to offer advice, to help him process the emotion. But his anima doesn't need solutions, it needs witnessing. The most powerful response is often the simplest. I see you. Not literally those words, but that energy. The energy that says, this part of you is welcome here. This is where most women get it wrong. They hear him express uncertainty about work and immediately jump into problem-solving mode. They start listing solutions, asking questions, trying to fix what he's feeling. But the anima doesn't want to be fixed, it wants to be felt. When you resist the urge to solve and instead simply acknowledge what he's experiencing, you're speaking to his soul. The same principle applies when he shares memories, dreams, or moments from his past. Most women either dismiss these as irrelevant or try to analyze their psychological significance. But the anima shared that memory for a reason, not to be understood, but to be witnessed. Your job isn't to interpret why he told you about building forts as a child. Your job is to honor that the memory matters to him. Even in daily interactions, presence trumps pressure. When he comes home quiet and withdrawn, the impulse is to probe, to ask what's wrong, to fill the silence with questions. But sometimes the most profound connection happens when you simply exist alongside his mood without trying to change it. This isn't about ignoring him, it's about respecting his internal process. Jung observed that men often struggle with what he called feeling thinking, the ability to process emotions without immediately jumping to action or analysis. When you create space for him to simply feel without needing to do anything about it, you're connecting with his anima. You're showing him that his inner world has value, even when it doesn't lead to a solution. This is particularly crucial because most men have been conditioned from childhood to suppress their anima. Society teaches boys that emotions are weakness, that intuition is unreliable, that vulnerability is dangerous. By the time they reach adulthood, many men have buried their anima so deeply that they've forgotten it exists. They live entirely from their masculine consciousness, logical, goal-oriented, emotionally controlled, while their soul slowly withers from neglect. But the anima never truly disappears. It shows up in unexpected moments, in dreams, in artistic expressions, in the quiet longings they don't understand. A successful businessman might find himself inexplicably drawn to painting. A stoic father might tear up at a children's movie. A rational engineer might feel compelled to write poetry he'll never show anyone. These aren't random impulses. They're the anima crying out for recognition, for connection, for someone who can see and value this hidden part of his nature. When you learn to recognize these moments, when you respond to them with interest rather than surprise, with acceptance rather than analysis, you create something profound, a safe space for his soul to emerge. You become the person in his life who doesn't just tolerate his depth, you cherish it. And once a man experiences this level of soul-level acceptance, he will instinctively protect and prioritize the relationship that provides it. The second principle is what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without trying to resolve them. Men often live in internal contradiction. They want intimacy but fear vulnerability. They crave connection but need independence. Most women try to resolve these contradictions through conversation or compromise, but the anima doesn't want resolution, it wants acceptance. When you can hold space for both sides of him, the strong and the sensitive, the confident and the uncertain, without trying to choose which one is real, you're speaking his soul's language. You're showing him that he doesn't have to choose between different parts of himself to be worthy of love. This acceptance is revolutionary because it challenges everything most men have been taught about relationships. They've learned that love is conditional, that they must maintain certain qualities to remain lovable. They must always be strong, never show weakness, always have answers, never admit confusion. This creates an exhausting performance that disconnects them from their authentic selves. But when you love his contradictions, when you can appreciate both his strength and his vulnerability, his confidence and his uncertainty, you're offering him something he's rarely experienced: unconditional acceptance of his complete humanity. You're not asking him to be perfect, you're asking him to be real. And for many men, this is the first time they've encountered love that doesn't require them to hide parts of themselves. The impact of this cannot be overstated. When a man feels safe to be contradictory, to be complex, to be fully human without fear of rejection, he relaxes at a soul level. The constant vigilance of maintaining an image dissolves. The exhaustion of performance fades. He can finally breathe, finally be, finally connect from his authentic center rather than from his protective shell. What happens next is remarkable. As he begins to trust that his contradictions are acceptable, he starts revealing deeper layers of himself. The parts he's kept hidden, his fears, his dreams, his creative impulses, his emotional depth, begin to surface naturally. This isn't because you've asked him to open up or because you've analyzed him into vulnerability. It's because you've created an environment where his soul feels safe to emerge. This process often surprises women who have struggled for years to get men to open up. They've tried direct questions, emotional conversations, relationship talks, all focused on getting him to reveal more. But the anima doesn't respond to interrogation, it responds to acceptance. When you stop trying to extract his emotions and start simply accepting whatever he offers, he begins to offer more. Not because he feels pressured to, but because he finally feels safe to. Men often describe this experience as liberating. For the first time, they don't have to choose between being strong or being sensitive, between being logical or being emotional. They can exist as complete human beings with all their complexities intact. And in that completeness, they discover aspects of themselves they'd forgotten existed, creativity they'd suppressed, tenderness they'd hidden, depth they'd been taught to ignore. This is revolutionary because most of society, including his family, friends, and previous relationships, has taught him that he must be consistent, logical, always in control. The woman who can love his contradictions becomes irreplaceable because she's the only person in his life who allows him to be fully human. The third principle involves what Jung called active imagination, the ability to engage with his inner world without trying to change it. Men often have rich fantasy lives, creative impulses, and intuitive insights that they've learned to hide because they don't fit the masculine ideal. When you show genuine interest in his dreams, his creative projects, his impractical ideas, you're connecting with his anima. But there's a crucial difference between showing interest and trying to manage his inner world. The anima responds to curiosity, not control. When he mentions a book he's reading, a hobby he's exploring, or a creative impulse he's considering, your response matters more than you realize. Most women either dismiss these interests as impractical or try to turn them into something productive. The man who wants to learn photography doesn't need you to research cameras or find classes for him. He needs you to acknowledge that this desire comes from somewhere meaningful within him. The man who mentions wanting to try cooking isn't asking you to solve his kitchen situation. He's sharing an impulse that connects him to creativity, to nurturing, to parts of himself he's been taught to ignore. This extends to how he processes the world around him, the movies that move him, the music he plays when he's alone, the stories he tells. These aren't random preferences, they're expressions of his anima. When you notice these moments, without trying to understand or categorize them, when you can appreciate his emotional responses without needing to share them, you're honoring the fullness of who he is. But there's a crucial difference between showing interest and trying to manage his inner world. The anima responds to curiosity, not control. Ask about his childhood dreams, the books that changed him, the moments when he felt most alive. Listen not to understand his psychology, but to witness his soul. The difference is profound, and he will feel it immediately. As you begin to practice these principles, you'll notice something remarkable happening. He starts to seek you out, not for practical reasons or physical attraction, but because you've become the space where he can access parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. You become associated with his own depth, his own creativity, his own capacity for wonder. This is when the real magic of Jung's insight reveals itself. Because when a man connects with his anima through you, he doesn't just open up, he transforms. The parts of himself he's been suppressing begin to integrate with his conscious personality. He becomes more whole, more authentic, more capable of genuine intimacy. And as he transforms, so does the relationship. It stops being about what you can get from each other and becomes about who you can become together. The connection deepens beyond attraction, beyond compatibility, into something Jung called the mysterium conjunctionis, the mysterious union of souls. Some women fear that this approach requires them to be perfect, to always say the right thing, to constantly monitor their responses. But the opposite is true. The anima responds to authenticity, not perfection. When you're genuinely present, genuinely curious, genuinely accepting of his contradictions, you don't have to perform or strategize. You simply have to be. There's also a profound shift that happens within you when you learn to see and honor a man's anima. You stop trying to change him, fix him, or complete him. You recognize that he's already whole. He just needs space to remember it. This releases you from the exhausting role of being his therapist, his motivator, or his emotional manager. You can simply be his witness, his companion, his partner, in the deepest sense of the word. This shift transforms not only how you relate to him, but how you understand masculinity itself. You begin to see that true masculine strength isn't the absence of emotion, it's the integration of all aspects of the self. The men who seem most powerful, most magnetic, most deeply attractive aren't those who have eliminated their feminine qualities, but those who have learned to honor and integrate them. When you learn to see and connect with a man's anima, you're not just improving your relationship, you're participating in his journey toward wholeness. You're helping him reclaim parts of himself that society taught him to abandon. You're supporting his evolution into the kind of man who can lead from strength while loving from tenderness, who can protect while remaining open, who can be decisive while staying connected to his heart. Jung believed that true connection happens when two people can see each other's complete souls, not just the polished surfaces they present to the world, but the full spectrum of their humanity. When you learn to recognize and honor a man's anima, you're not just improving your relationship with him. You're modeling a way of loving that honors the full complexity of human nature. And perhaps most importantly, this approach creates a kind of love that doesn't diminish over time, because you're not connected to his roles, his achievements, or his ability to meet your needs. You're connected to his essence, the part of him that remains constant, even as everything else changes. This is the foundation of what Jung called psychological relationship, a bond that transcends the temporary and touches the eternal. The men who experience this kind of connection often describe it as life-changing, not because the woman did something to them, but because she created the conditions for them to remember who they truly are. She became the mirror that reflected not just their strength, but their soul. This is the secret Jung discovered about connecting with a man's deepest self. It's not about speaking louder or more clearly. It's about speaking to the part of him that's been waiting, in silence, to be seen. And when you learn this language, the language of the soul, everything changes. Not just for him, but for you. Because in learning to see his anima, you begin to understand the profound depth that exists within every human being. And that understanding transforms not just your relationships, but your entire approach to love. If this helped you see things differently, subscribe for more content like this. And if you found real value here, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching.